All right. Welcome to WTF, the rise of the Tech Broligarchy, a bi-weekly political education series brought to you by Media Justice. I'm Atang Etta, coming to you live on Zoom and streaming across social media, except TikTok, which ironically happened to ban us from using their live feature just hours before this program. So, for those of us who missed last session, we'll quickly recap what we covered. So, we talked about the ongoing purge of the federal workforce by Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. We spoke to the former chief technologist at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Erie Meyer, who described in detail the chaos that workers inside of federal agencies are experiencing right now. Here are some lessons we drew from talking with Erie and with Ryan Greenwood at National's People Action. So one, behind the chaotic headlines, the intent of Elon Musk and the tech oligarchs is to reshape government in order to preserve and expand their wealth. DOGE is getting rid of accountability, not fraud. And the gutting of the CFPB, an agency with active investigations against major tech corporations, is the clearest example of this. And three, the tech oligarchs are counting on our silence. They're counting on people like you and me, just letting them hack our democracy. But of course, as we know, the people are not letting that happen. So over the weekend, we saw thousands gathered in front of Tesla showrooms across the country to protest Elon Musk. These protests are part of an organic campaign called Tesla Takedown. The campaign is calling on people to hit Elon Musk's bottom line by peacefully protesting outside of Tesla dealerships, selling your Tesla cars, and dumping your Tesla stock. So how are Trump and Musk reacting? By doing an infomercial for Tesla cars on the White House lawn. WTF indeed. The infomercial was live streamed on X, the social media platform owned by Musk, and orchestrated to help boost Tesla stock, which has plummeted about 40% since the start of this year. Trump pretending to have an interest in Tesla cars is only the latest example of how this administration is throwing its weight around to bolster big tech's bottom line. Last month, we saw Trump go after European countries threatening tariffs as retaliation for imposing digital taxes and regulating big tech companies. Executives from Alphabet, the parent company of Google, and Meta, the parent company of Facebook, followed that up by calling the EU's regulations on AI excessive, a sentiment echoed by JD Vance at the recent International AI Action Summit in Paris. So for the purposes of today's topic, what's notable about the collusion between Trump and tech oligarchs like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg is that tech is shaping geopolitical conflict across the world. Big tech's interests, as well as national security and economic interests, are becoming one and the same. So today, we're going to dig deeper into the unfolding of and the current status of the TikTok ban in what has become a proxy for US-China relations. So again, we want to welcome everybody who's tuned in. Whether you're tuned in from social or on Zoom with us, would love folks to drop in the comments where you're joining from and what aspect of the TikTok ban you've been most curious about. So we're going to get into a really great timeline of events and the who's who, but really want to take this opportunity to get a sense of who's in the room with us tonight. So we've got folks from Berkeley. Shout out to Berkeley in the house. Feel free to keep dropping in the chat where you're from, what you're curious about. We've got Oakland. The Bay is here. The Bay is out here. We've got PG County, Maryland, outside of DC. Folks are curious about, if we're banning TikTok, what does that mean for Facebook and Twitter? We've got Atlanta, we've got Southern Arizona, Baltimore, Massachusetts. So as we continue, feel free to continue sharing where you're joining from. Shout out to Uganda. Love that we're international. So keep sharing in the chat where you're from and what aspects of the TikTok ban you're curious to hear about. We've got a lot in store for you all tonight, but also really want to get a sense of what in particular, what are the reasons why folks are tuned in for this one. So with that, as folks continue doing that, so let's start from the beginning. So as we know, there's been quite a few twists and turns in this saga. So we're going to start with a timeline of events so we feel really clear about where we are and what's taken place so far. So pictured here is TikTok CEO Xiaozi Chu at Trump's inauguration this past January. And I'm sure, as we all remember, just a few days before this image was taken, the US Supreme Court had upheld a law that in effect banned TikTok in the United States. So there was a temporary TikTok shutdown on January 19th that lasted less than 12 hours until Trump signed an executive order on his inauguration day, postponing the TikTok ban for 75 days. So how did we get here? So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the same person who delayed the TikTok ban was also the same one who started it. So in 2020, Trump issued sanctions against TikTok, claiming that the app's collection of user data, including location and internet search history, threatened national security because TikTok was owned by ByteDance, a company based in China. That 2020 ban was struck down by a court, but last year, under the Biden administration, Congress passed the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, which essentially mandated that TikTok separate from its Chinese ownership. In other words, sell to the US or get kicked out of the US. In response, TikTok sued the US government on the basis of free speech, but the Supreme Court upheld the ban passed by Congress, indicating that national security was more important than free speech. And based on Trump's order of a 75-day postponement of the ban, TikTok has until April 5th to sell. And so forcing a sale is precisely what Trump is trying to do. Last week, he announced the US was in talks with 4 groups over the TikTok sale. And the potential suitors? Some names that we have become familiar with within this series, including tech oligarchs Larry Ellison, who runs Oracle, and Satya Nadella, who runs Microsoft. So let's break down why the TikTok ban and the forced sale of its platform is happening. We'll counter the most common arguments we're hearing about the TikTok ban, and then we'll lay out who stands to gain the most from TikTok being banned. So starting with why this is happening. So TikTok is one of the most popular social media platforms in the United States. More than a third of Americans use TikTok. That's about 170 million monthly users. That's more users than Snapchat and X, and about the same as Instagram and Facebook. And that's quite a rise for a company that's been around for less than 10 years. So it would stand to reason that competitors like Facebook and X wouldn't mind to see this platform banned in the US. Now let's talk about some of the most common reasons that are being used to justify the TikTok ban. Starting with one of the arguments we're hearing the most about, that TikTok is a Chinese-owned company and therefore controlled by the Chinese government. Let's briefly set aside the red baiting for a moment and focus just on who actually owns TikTok. The app is owned by TikTok LLC, a limited liability company incorporated in Delaware and based in Culver City, California. The LLC is controlled by TikTok Limited, which is registered in the Cayman Islands and based in Shanghai. That firm is ultimately owned by ByteDance Limited, also incorporated in the Cayman Islands and based in Beijing. So the argument that TikTok is Chinese owned ultimately comes down to its parent company, ByteDance, a technology giant valued at $400 billion. So as you can see on the map, starting on the right, ByteDance headquarters are in Beijing. And ByteDance has 28 investors from China and 27 investors from the United States. ByteDance ownership was explained by TikTok CEO Xiaozi Chu in a congressional hearing held in 2023. He stated, quote, ByteDance is not owned or controlled by the Chinese government. It is a private company. 60% of the company is owned by global institutional investors. 20% is owned by the founder, and 20% owned by employees around the world. ByteDance has 5 board members. 3 of them are American. So getting a bit more into those board members. So one board member is William E. Ford, who's the current CEO of General Atlantic, a New York-based private equity firm. Ford is a financial contributor to the Republican Party. His spouse donated over $1 million to a super PAC affiliated with Trump. Another individual investor worth noting is Wendy Murdoch, former spouse of Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul billionaire who owns Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Post, and many more media channels. A significant US shareholder is Susquehanna International Group, a venture capital firm owned by billionaire Jeff Yass, also a mega donor to the Republican Party. And as of April 2024, Susquehanna held a 15% stake in ByteDance, valued at around $34 billion. Sequoia Capital, another notable US venture capital firm, has made several investments in ByteDance. Roloff Boitia, a managing partner at the firm, is the former CFO of PayPal and part of the so-called PayPal mafia, a group that has kept close ties to Elon Musk since the early 2000s. These are just a few of the ties between US investors and TikTok. So the idea that TikTok is Chinese owned is misleading entirely. So the next common argument we hear for reasons why TikTok should be banned is that the US national security is at stake because the Chinese government has direct access to the data of users in the United States. Trump in 2020 said that TikTok, quote, threatens to allow the Chinese Communist Party access to Americans' personal and proprietary information. So theoretically, ByteDance is subject to China's national intelligence laws, which requires any organization or citizen to support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence work. So try to set aside for a moment that US tech companies collaborate with the federal government in the same exact way. The US government has also admitted any national security risk posed by TikTok is largely speculative. So despite the rhetoric, the ban on TikTok isn't about national security, and it's definitely not about data privacy. The Chinese government doesn't need control of TikTok to access all the data that gets collected through apps like TikTok. This data can be purchased completely legally from commercial data brokers, companies that buy and sell information at a global scale. If that sounds shady, it is. And so we don't have to look abroad for examples of tech companies infringing on digital privacy. Twitter and its later Elon Musk-owned iteration X has long partnered with the artificial intelligence company Dataminr, which supplies social media monitoring data to police agencies. So if the US was really concerned about data privacy, it would dismantle big tech's business model altogether, a business model rooted in what Shoshana Zuboff describes as surveillance capitalism. Tech corporations rely on a business model that is predicated on extracting as much data as possible from us. The decisions about how, when, why, and who else can have access to our data is largely determined by corporations who do not have to follow any rules to protect our privacy. So our data is extracted, monetized, and then weaponized against the most marginalized among us. And yes, TikTok does this, but so does Facebook, X, and most other large social media platforms. So the idea that TikTok is a Chinese company is false, especially when you consider that many of its largest investors are, in fact, from the United States. The idea that the US's national security is threatened by TikTok is silly because data under surveillance capitalism has been commodified through the data broker industry. So now that I've had the chance to get us through why this has happened, as well as debunk some of the core arguments we're hearing around why TikTok should be banned, I want to get into who ultimately stands to benefit the most from a ban like this. So starting with Mark Zuckerberg. So Zuckerberg had spent years at this point trying to break into the Chinese market so he could get access to millions of users he wanted to make money off of. He was repeatedly denied. He also tried to buy TikTok's predecessor, Musical.ly, and also failed at that. So then a significant thing in 2020 happened. And so, not referring to COVID, but referring to the fact that TikTok surpassed Facebook and Instagram as the most downloaded app in the United States. It was the first Chinese app to threaten the dominance of the major social media platforms and to dominate the American market, the first real competition for Facebook. So Zuckerberg ultimately failed in his bid to make Facebook available in China. And an interesting side note, last note, Zuckerberg won a court ruling stopping a former employee from promoting her memoir, which discusses Facebook's work to build a censorship tool that would have supported Facebook's presence in China. So one of the clear winners of the TikTok ban is Mark Zuckerberg and the other tech oligarchs who own social media platforms. So who else stands to benefit from the TikTok ban? Would you have guessed Israel? Following Trump's failed attempt to ban TikTok in 2020, these efforts gained new momentum over the past year and a half as Israel's destruction of Gaza took place. It seemed that most traditional and digital media in the US pushed media coverage that was favorable to Israel. And so, oddly enough, TikTok seemed like the exception, which only meant that they weren't actively purging content from Palestinians like other platforms were, like Instagram, for example. So as a result, TikTok was banned was blamed as the reason thousands of young people in the US were protesting on their college campuses against Israel's war in Gaza. Republicans and Democrats alike reacted by claiming any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Senator Josh Hawley called TikTok a, quote, purveyor of anti-Semitic lies. Then Secretary of State Anthony Blinken also blamed TikTok for Israel's lack of support among some people in the US. Mike Lawler, a Republican congressman from New York, authored a bipartisan bill that would ban TikTok by sneaking it into a military aid package for Ukraine and Israel. And one of the major lobbying pushes for that bill came from groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, and other organizations aligned with Israel. So I just want to take a moment to underline this point that both tech oligarchs like Mark Zuckerberg and countries like Israel were the biggest beneficiaries of the TikTok ban. So circling back to where we started. So last week, Trump announced the US was in talks with 4 groups over the TikTok sale. One of the front runners is the company Oracle, one of the largest data brokers and data servers in the world. Oracle is owned by one of the members of the tech oligarchy, billionaire Larry Ellison. So there's 3 important things to know about Oracle in particular. The first being Oracle was the first multinational tech company to offer cloud services to Israel back in 2021. establishing a $319 million data center in Jerusalem. Oracle CEO Safra Katz attended a private lobbying meeting with US senators last year to advocate for the continuation of weapon shipments to Israel. And in the fall, Oracle announced it was partnering with Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, one of Israel's largest defense companies, on an AI project to serve Israeli warfighters. The second thing that's important to know about Oracle is that their servers are where TikTok has been exclusively storing data of US users since 2022. And finally, while the headlines talk about US concerns about the Chinese government and what they would do with data from Americans, Oracle proudly partners with law enforcement and sold its CIA-backed Indica software that has been used against protesters from Chicago to China. So the US exports technology to governments for police use around the world. So ultimately, if Oracle is successful, it may turn out to be the biggest beneficiary, and it would turn out that that would support Israel in incredible ways. So what happens next? So Trump has indicated he plans to meet that April 5th deadline that's coming up very shortly. And he's mentioned a potential future setup of the US owning 50% of the app. Last month, Trump ordered the creation of a US sovereign wealth fund, which could purchase the app. However, no further details were provided. Other than Oracle, a handful of other contenders have been named in the purchase of TikTok. One noteworthy group of investors in the running is a group called the People's Bid for TikTok. So, who are the people behind the People's Bid? Reddit co-founder and venture capitalist Alexis Ohanian and billionaire Frank McCourt. So here to help us continue making sense of the real stakes and story behind the TikTok sale is journalist Samir Rao. Samir Rao is a journalist and editor at Technically, principally overseeing coverage of Baltimore and DC. He joined the team in February 2022, following a position reporting on the legal industry and access to justice issues for Law 360, an online news outlet aimed at an international audience of legal professionals, and several years as an arts and culture reporter for such outlets as the Baltimore Sun and Color Lines. Welcome, Samir. Let's put some emojis in the chat. Really excited to be in conversation with you, and a lot of respect for the incredible work that you've done and continue to do. So thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the comprehensive overview. I have to admit, there are little bits of this narrative that I learned through this or was reminded of. So again, I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. So let's get into it. So I want to start off by giving you the opportunity to tell us about Technically for folks who might not be familiar with this outlet.
For sure. So we are an online news outlet that covers tech, entrepreneurship, startups, and some related topics like economic development, workforce development, digital equity, a lot of things under this sort of umbrella. And we principally we cover across the nation, across the world as sort of relevant to different trends and broader issues. But within this lane, we principally most of our coverage is focused on four geographies. So I edit our Baltimore and DC coverage. I'm based in Baltimore. I work with reporters in both regions. And we also cover Philadelphia, which is where our company was founded about 16 years ago, and Pittsburgh. That's again not the only places that we cover, but those are sort of the majority that stories from those four ecosystems probably constitute maybe like 80% of what we publish. We also, as a publication, do other things outside of our editorial work, we like have a jobs board for tech industry jobs. We have an events board where people in and out of our ecosystems can post different events, and we also do a community Slack, and we do a conference every year in Philadelphia. This year, it's in on May 8th and 9th. It's called the Builders Conference. So yeah, we do a lot of our coverage, as an industry publication. It tends to, we consider technologists and entrepreneurs as well as those aspiring to those types of positions to be kind of our core audience, but we're not paywalled. And because of the breadth of the things that we cover, we try to reach to pretty much anyone who has any interest in the topics that we might cover, whether it's national, international, or more localized.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking that down for us. So, I'm going to start us broad and then we'll get more specific here. So, something that I've been seeing folks share online is folks making connections between if an app like TikTok can get banned, like that is opening the floodgates. It won't stop there. So, I want to get your thoughts on what do you think about a government banning a social media app as a concept in general?
I feel, well, as a baseline, I think that, any attempt to curtail free speech on our predominant like community communications platforms is wrong and like a violation of free speech principles. Um, I do past that, I'd say it's a little bit complicated for me because I think that for all of us that operate on social media or care about what happens on social media, whether it's the way that we use it or what these platforms do on a broader scale, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that really bad things happen on these platforms that are owned by or operated by companies, oftentimes multinationals that don't uh do much to stop those bad things from happening, whether it's like the the proliferation of hate speech or the ability for people to organize to like go commit acts of violence, of targeted violence, or the sort of peddling of like child pornography. There's all sorts of things that happen on these apps where these social media companies that run them, which are not in and of themselves like, you know, these are massive employers, right? These are massive multinational like uh employers. They operate in ways where they can kind of hide behind the principle of free speech to allow whatever happens. But at the end of the day, that also enables a lot of really bad things to happen. If you look at some of the regulatory approaches of certain parts of the government under the Biden administration, and I know you had um uh I'm gonna get their name wrong, but Yui Meyer, if I'm pronouncing that right. On the last episode of this program, there were actions taken to try and break up some of these companies. I think banning outright feels like a step too far, but the conversation that we're having today and even that question, I think, speaks at the heart of something that we've encountered a lot throughout our history, which is uh, what does it actually mean for private entities to control so many of these vital pipelines for us to get information, to communicate with one another, to build and sustain communities, maybe to find jobs, maybe to build skills, and unfortunately to do things like organize groups to go commit mob violence, as happens in some countries, and has as the sort of fallout of the Unite the Right violence in 2017 shows in our country as well. But banning outright, and of course with the example of the TikTok ban for all of the reasons that you stated before, is it's it's a move that undercuts the hypocrisy and shows the hypocrisy, or sorry, underscores the hypocrisy of how we approach big tech in general and social media platforms specifically, in a way that, if someone really thinks that this ban would be an effective way to counter like or to like address national security concerns, um the entire hypocrisy of the way that it's gone about actually just like kills that argument and makes it irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's spot on. And I appreciate you naming both the ways that folks have used social media platforms to organize, get information, participate in society in general. And obviously, we see the ways that hate speech and folks organizing to take violence offline has also happened. And so, a ban outright does not address large complex issues that do need to be addressed in some ways, but in other mechanisms.
Right.
Um,
I'd just say also there's a difference between like an outright ban and like very concerted aggressive regulation. And I think the latter can be done in a way that doesn't violate free speech principles.
right, right. It's not a either or for sure. Um,
Exactly.
And so technically has been covering issues surrounding the TikTok ban. That's one of the many reasons we're excited to have you here with us. You all have been covering this from a variety of different angles, and one of those being the community impact. And so we know with tech issues can get really wonky really quickly, but folks on the ground are being impacted by this. And so I'm curious if you can share more about what concerns TikTok users have discussed.
Sure. So and just to give a bit of context in addition to what I had said before about our publication. So given that we have this sort of localized lens, and even with some of our national, international coverage, we try to kind of get the sense and the perspective and sort of these connections of how these big international or national developments trickle down into like the local economies that a lot of us, work in. And yeah, I'm looking at this chat and where people say they're from. I mean, very few people here are from like it seems like the epicenters that we kind of consider being like the heart of tech. Like when we think of tech, we think of the Valley or Seattle or New York or whatever. And so we try to focus on these four kind of core ecosystems, which kind of with the exception of DC, because it is so big, and the federal government contracts a lot and with tech companies, um, is a slight exception, but we try to focus on these economies where innovation matters and where there's a lot of money behind innovation and business, just startup kind of economy, but it doesn't necessarily get the attention as that it does in Silicon Valley because there's not as much money flowing around. The ecosystems just look different. So, how does this relate to our coverage about TikTok and the TikTok ban? Is that when we were covering it as much as possible, tried to get perspectives from people working in and existing and using social media in our ecosystems. So I'll point to an article that I can drop in the chat here. I'll just drop it real quick. Written by our reporter in Pittsburgh, Alice Crow, as well as our editor, Katie Malone, um, in which Pittsburgh and the Delaware and Philly area based creators kind of talked about what this actually means for them. And one thing that kind of came out through this coverage and other coverage we've done is that if you're someone who's in this very lucrative creator economy and you are putting a lot of your eggs in the TikTok basket, you're kind of, you're setting yourself up with all this evolution that happens with social media platforms to have to like migrate somewhere else or like lose a bunch of your influence. It's not that TikTok necessarily is like where creators are making the vast majority of their income, but it is a place where you're building followers, you're building community, and to lose that on such a popular platform, on a platform that became sort of the platform du jour of the creator economy, means that you're losing a lot of, if not economic, uh, sort of basis for what you're doing as a creator, then you're losing a lot of that social and broader kind of um, other forms of quote unquote capital that are allowing you to have this career. So at that level, I mean, it's a choice to become an online creator, right? But in this world that we live in, where, platforms like TikTok are a massive, they are the way that people communicate, they're the way that people learn, the way that people put their narratives or put things out there, like the amount of TikTok creators who when they comment on issues, they'll cite other news outlets and try to not have this be like a thing where you're just reacting to narrative, you're not basing it in facts. I think that is where the impact has kind of been seen. It's really in, social media platforms generally, even when produced by these, morally bankrupt kind of multinational companies, do allow for people to build community that is both local and further afield. And so that's kind of the thing that we had been seeing in a lot of our coverage, when we were talking to local creators and people who engage with TikTok about this ban and what it could have meant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's helpful to hear that. I think about when I was on TikTok around that time where the initial ban was looming, seeing a lot of creators sharing about how like this is such a source of income, and appreciate you naming the difficulties and migrating the community, and like knowing that, it's not necessarily going to be the same. It's very difficult to kind of pick up and start up.
Yeah,
Um,
and especially because TikTok and affiliated platforms like I'm just gonna make sure I get the name right. Uh, I'm just looking at this article. CapCut, especially because that these platforms kind of lent themselves to a sort of way of communicating that would be harder on other platforms, in a way of being able to kind of put your voice out there, even if you don't have a lot of like technical experience or something like that. So yeah, but I cut you off. You were saying.
No, no, no. I was gonna keeping us on the community impact tip here. Technically has also covered the rhetoric around China being a foreign adversary and how that has impacted the Asian American community in particular. And so would love to get into your thoughts in terms of like what your reporting has revealed about that particular impact, since obviously we know, like was shared before, the TikTok ban has been a proxy for anti-China, anti-communist sentiments.
Absolutely. So, and I'm dropping an article, the article that you're referencing here that was written for us by a contributor, Janelle Andes. Um, what sort of came out from Janelle's reporting that has also been something that she and I and a lot of us have observed just sort of in discourse around the TikTok ban. For me, I think principally I've seen it in like Asian American circles, whether they're like advocacy circles or journalist circles, is this sense of like, as you kind of talked about before, there was a hypocrisy in pursuing this one platform and suggesting that it was this national security concern, that because this parent company is like headquartered in Beijing outweighs the myriad of social of quote unquote national security concerns that take place on platforms that came out of Silicon Valley all the time. I mean, when we talk about things like disinformation campaigns or sort of like the algorithmic bias towards far right content or something like that, every social media platform has blood on its hands. But what, of course, accompanied a lot of this, the sort of the pushback against TikTok was the specific national security concern that was never really publicly qualified in any substantive way outside of like a little bit of reporting that to me didn't really suggest that TikTok was that much more threatening again than any other media outlet on which like the Chinese government is equally capable of running disinformation campaigns or doing some kind of interference. Um, if you believe this like national security line, at least, um, was this sense that, the rhetoric against TikTok plays into a very long history of seeing things from China or people from the East Asia as being like foreign, always undermining like the fabric of America or whatever, being this threat. And this goes back, over a century, right? This is to me very, and to people that commented in Janelle's article, a lot of this is just feels very rooted in the yellow peril rhetoric that had, accompanied the first sort of larger scale emigration of Chinese laborers to the United States. There's this idea that somehow, no matter what you do, no matter who you are, even if you say create a company that could be like on that level of the great like titans of tech that our governments on both sides of the political aisle, our administrations have like uplifted as like the example of like American ingenuity. Even if you do that, even if you play that game, you will just be seen as a foreigner. Janelle's article specifically references and I'm just going to scroll to make sure I get folks' names right. But the congressional testimony of like of the TikTok CEO who repeatedly said, I'm Singaporean, and people just asking, senators asking him, like, are you some kind of agent of China or something to that effect? I mean, these are the same kinds of things that we saw with the original, like Yellow Peril backlash. These are the things that we saw with the reaction to COVID-19. These are all sorts of things that both underscore the hypocrisy and can play into real things, as we saw with the COVID reaction. Like there's actually like there's real world impacts to this rhetoric, right? People get hurt, people get attacked in racist assaults and hate crimes. So I think that there was something there that we needed to uncover. And so we did this report where Janelle talked to a lot of people, including some non-Asian American plaintiffs within one of the lawsuits challenging the ban, but also Asian Americans working in media, community organizing, some who are creators on TikTok, who really spoke to like, okay, there is this thing that we get from it, and actually in some instances it helps us build community and like tell our narratives as creators. um and a lot of folks also said like, why would you target this one outlet? Tech, big tech should be, and massive tech multinationals should be subject to the same scrutiny. Why is one outlet worse than the other?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, exactly. Um, and it's making me think about getting into one of the other common arguments we hear is a lot around data privacy. So you're starting to touch on it in that like TikTok is not alone in um, having access to our data. And so we know that, to your point about Yellow Peril, there's more underneath why this specific company is being targeted. What is, in your opinion, what's the terrain of data privacy fights? And again, bringing it back to the communities, which I really appreciate how central communities are to Technically's reporting. What are you hearing from communities you cover about their concerns when it comes to actual data privacy?
Sure. So I guess to talk about it removed from like social media generally, because the data privacy concerns, as you said before, are widespread. And when it comes to social media outlets, it's like they're kind of, you see them across platforms. I mean, every time that we hear about data being breached or data being like sold the way that Facebook had sold its like Cambridge Analytica a couple of years ago, data being, appropriated by governments to suppress, to like find out who they needed to jail or suppress or whomever. But with respect to data privacy, I guess generally within the communities that we cover, I think one thing we have seen is it first off, I think some of the landscape around the concerns, they didn't change after Trump's latest inauguration. They maybe just got a bit more heightened
Mm.
after they saw the rise of the Broligarchy. Uh, and by the way, I love that term. Thank you for raising it into the discourse. But yeah, I think that there is a sense of just worry about data privacy when we see the members of the Broligarchy, particularly Elon, but not just Elon, with Doge, doing all of these things to get their hands on government data, or data that is within buried, not buried, but within federal government agencies, that it seems from all indications they want to kind of like turn over to AI and use for nefarious purposes, that then put Americans' data in the hands of this technology that everyone says is like the wave of the future, and we all like want to learn more about and use, but also we don't fully know what the implications of that technology are yet, right? So I think that that's a concern that has arisen, but also part of the discourse that we've reported on specifically is is this idea of like as whatever the federal government was doing, there are states that we cover, regions that we cover, where state governments have been, or state legislators and lawmakers and executives have been trying, and in some cases succeeding in implementing their own data privacy laws. Maryland has a law on the books that our governor has signed into law, and enforcement of it won't begin until next year. But it is already slated to go into effect, I believe, this fall, and it has been sort of evaluated as being perhaps one of the most comprehensive state level data privacy laws in the country. You know, of course, regardless of what Elon and the Trump administration are doing right now, data privacy has not. I believe we've been maybe a little bit hampered by not having a pretty comprehensive national federal data privacy law on the level of, say, what the EU has, or what is looking to be implemented in other countries, if not being implemented or being on the books in other countries. And so really the states, particularly as they have to kind of take on, or they're compelled to take on this role where they can sort of position themselves as protectors of consumer privacy. Whether that has teeth to be enforced in Maryland or elsewhere, I think remains to be seen. But that is, and I'd also say that I think that's part and parcel of an approach that we saw in the last Trump administration, and we've seen with other issues, whether it's reproductive justice or immigration and deportation policies, where state governments often run by Democrats, but that are opposed to federal policy, will use their own agency to be kind of a bulwark against federal government policies that they disagree with, whether it's, conservative run states that have tried to like destroy reproductive justice for in the face of like a federal government that was trying to, ostensibly trying to protect like abortion rights and stuff, or the reverse, where in Maryland we enshrined in our Constitution the right to reproductive services. Um, I think that this is part of a trend that we're seeing. And then with respect to the private economy, I mean, I haven't seen much in the way of like company founders who are massively concerned about it, other than, seeing this regulatory environment that's so chaotic, and the state and local and federal kind of components being so confusing to navigate for their own policies. But I think on an individual level, when I go out and talk to people, I think that I haven't encountered anyone who is like, our data is fine, or
Mhm.
thank God we have access to all of these people's data. Thank God the federal government gave us this. They want their companies to be in compliance, and they also don't want like that's the impression I get anyway. It's maybe a similar reaction to a lot of things where like, and I know I'm rambling, so I'll tie this up in a sec, but I think it's similar to a lot of the ways that people just kind of treat social media, which is like, oh God, I wish I didn't like give all this data away, but they already have all this data, right? So that's kind of what I've perceived and what I've seen within and outside of our reporting.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to hear that no matter who you're talking to across the board, folks agree that like data privacy is an issue. It is not something that folks feel that is actually, a right of theirs that's being respected. So I've got a two-parter for you. And then unfortunately we'll have to come to a close. So this is a big two-parter. So first part is a lot of folks are seeing TikTok. If TikTok doesn't get banned, it's being seen as a win for free speech. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that sentiment about censorship and social media platforms as it relates to what you've seen in your reporting. And then the second part, so big juicy question here, as an independent publication, which, thank you for your work for so many reasons, but especially in this current corporate media landscape. Can you share more about how you all are navigating amongst corporate media in hopes that might compel and inspire and uplift other types of independent publications?
Sure, absolutely, because at some level the answers to those two parts are if they're not the same, they're conjoined. So with respect to this, this being seen as a free speech win, I I want to caution people against playing into this narrative too much because I feel like the people who disproportionately benefit from this narrative, it's not us, it's TikTok. And like at the end of the day, ByteDance is a tech company. It is, as you mentioned in earlier on, it is a tech company. And I would caution us against even particularly people who are very invested in critiquing the hypocrisy and kind of corporatization and violence of the United States government's decisions and the United States economic titans' decisions. Like, don't give this other company too much credit. It is
Mhm.
still a social media platform. It is still a company that has access to a lot of your data. Maybe there are ways that it interacts with like questions of ethics that are different than the ways that Meta or anybody else in the or any other company whose owners are in the tech broligarchy operate. But TikTok is TikTok, you know what I mean? So it's still social media. It's still a tech company. So I would just be cautious about that narrative. However, I mean, you ban this app, then you open up a door for other things to get banned, right? What's stopping at that point, a platform like Signal where all of our communications are encrypted, where I talk to sources that don't want to talk on other platforms, like what happens there?
Right.
Especially now that we have like this entity in Doge where you have like children who are still very much more technically sophisticated than the vast majority of us, able to access a lot of information. I mean, what does that mean for the future of encrypted communications? That's actually something I'm very interested in, don't have great answers for. But for us as a media outlet, I also think about like what this means for our free speech in this era where and my our boss, my CEO, Chris Wink, who's also a journalist and writes a weekly column for us, has talked about this at some length, this idea that like the creator economy, the news world is and journalism is inextricably linked to it, at least for the time being, because people don't necessarily navigate towards like our website or they don't navigate to a news outlet's website when they're trying to find things. Where do they find some of this content? They'll find it on social media because someone shared it. So I think that that's something that we think about a lot as a publication. And that also relates to how I think we interact with sort of the bigger outlets. So in a I guess philosophical stance, I like to think that we have a lane that we operate in, having a localized angle and focusing on what happens in these places where maybe national media doesn't really pay a lot of attention, um, at least not all the time, is particularly helpful. I mean, the exception, of course, being DC, but we still cover startup economy and all of these entities in DC that are not necessarily being covered um, in the same way. When people cover tech in DC, it's usually about like these bigger companies. And so we have insight in the startup economy that I think is crucial. Um, but I think that, you know, there are also sort of practical ways that we try to interact with them. So at least in a regional sense, like we are part of media collaboratives in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and in Philadelphia, where we'll work with bigger outlets. I wouldn't say that they're like the biggest outlets in the world, but they're like the Inquirer, um, the Baltimore Banner, where we do a little bit of like collaboration around different articles. Some of the stuff is very early stage, so I can't speak to the breadth of what is done as much as what could be done. But I think that that kind of model where you get the bigger outlets that have more money, um, and be able to pair them up with outlets like ours that have a specific lens and a specific kind of in and insight, you kind of get to marry the best of both worlds in the most ideal of circumstances. I mean, at the end of the day, like the Wired's and the New York Times and the Washington Post of the world will just have more resources. But I think that for companies like ours, it's important to know that this is part of the world that you operate in, but you're not necessarily of that world. We can do things, we can have entry into certain spaces, we can cover certain issues, write certain articles that might be harder for them to report because their reporters just aren't as embedded in these places. On a
Yeah.
personal level, I will also say that I think that the bigger outlets in our industry, whether they're print or online or on TV, every single day they make editorial decisions that underscore their increasing irrelevance to the way that people consume news. They're still
Yeah.
big dogs. It still matters. I mean, I see on my Instagram feed all the time people will critique the way that the big dogs cover Gaza, but then like 3 stories later, they'll share the stories about like this is what footage over Gaza looks like. And it's like the things that allow them to do that are also the things that you critique. So it's like just kind of understand what that looks like. But I firmly feel that outlets like ours can kind of weather the economic storms, the political storms in a way that is just much harder for them. So, I have a lot of faith in independent media, and I have faith in it at this time, especially because the government is more concerned, at least at this stage, with how they interact with like CNN and the Post and the AP and uh they are not the entirety of our industry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, yeah.
It's a great note to end on for sure. So I want to thank you so much for joining us and expanding the conversation and offering a lot of really great optimism that there are folks like you and so many other publications that are doing such critical work at a moment right now. So thank you so much, Samir. And folks should definitely check out all of the great reporting that you dropped in the chat. So we're coming towards the end of our time. So I'm just going to briefly recap what we've learned today, and then we're going to offer some calls to action. So how are we going to take the lessons that we've learned today and immediately put them into practice? So 3 big top lines that we want folks to walk away with. So, one, forcing TikTok to sell to a US company does not protect user data. All of big tech prioritizes profit over our right to privacy. The second lesson is that our current prediction is that TikTok is going to be owned by Oracle, a tech giant owned by Broligarch Larry Ellison. Oracle makes its wealth by selling data of people like you and me, by operationalizing domestic surveillance of protesters, and by selling predictive policing and military technology to Israel, China, and other countries. And finally, TikTok is just the most recent example of monopoly platform ownership being a key strategy of the tech oligarchy. So, in essence, billionaires own the media infrastructure and the government, which is why media and technology is a key strategic fight that the left must take on. So, we are going to need to build power to fight big tech and big media. So, what's next in calls to action? So, what are we going to do from here? So, as big tech continues to broker deals that line their pockets, we know our people are still under attack. So, the recent arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, followed by the arrest of Laki Cordia, both part of pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University, is an escalation of the surveillance and criminalization of Black and Brown people and all who speak up against US violence at home and abroad. The government is claiming that the act of protesting genocide is an act of terrorism. So, as we've shared throughout this webinar, these recent arrests are deeply connected to the TikTok ban. The aim of this administration and the tech oligarchy behind them is to eliminate all spaces, both offline and online, where our people can resist oppression. And the Trump administration is trying to do this with the tech oligarchy as well. We saw this last week where Trump suggested that any people protesting against Tesla should also be labeled as domestic terrorists. So we have to face an important reality. Our liberation from a tech oligarchy is bound up with the liberation of Palestinians, the liberations of trans people, the liberation of migrants. Our struggles aren't separate. So that first action that's been dropped in the chat is to direct pressure to Congress to free Mahmoud Khalil. So take a look at that link. This is coming from our friends at Adala Justice Project. Our second call to action is to join a mass call hosted by the Tesla Takedown campaign. It's actually happening right after this call at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So a great opportunity to take exactly what you learned tonight and apply it directly a couple hours from now. So we're also dropping a link to RSVP to make sure you can register and join the Tesla Takedown campaign call that's happening at 8:30 tonight. So with that, that wraps up our webinar for today. So thank you so much for joining. There's so many other topics that we are going to be covering as a part of this political education series. So on the screen, you can register now. Join us for our next episode of WTF, the rise of the Tech Broligarchy, where we're going to be diving into WTF is tech doing on immigration. We'll see you there and have a good day. Take care.
Telling me, telling me, telling me, telling me, telling me, telling me you feel fine. Never leave, never leave, never leave, never leave, never leave in your side. Wanna keep you in my life, no need to move. Whenever you here, I feel like I can't lose. Baby, I wanna ride with you, I got so high, oh, I can't leave. I got your body all